didn't get the message, but I know you did, because I can see that this audience is the message. We have someone to sum it up for you, Miss Marsha P. Johnson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am stay-at-home for you called So. You can count your karma if Nirvana is your goal. You can shake and you can rattle. You can rock and roll. You can be a Clark Kent or a Lois or an Alice down a hole. You can be a vampire on a mountain with a heart of stone black coal. You can be a leather angel on a sleek black Harley bike. Or a redhead screaming faggot, or a dazzling dyke. You can lock yourself in a closet in a fine meat stove, but it really doesn't matter if you ain't got soul.
Marsha P. Johnson was a poor African-American, often homeless, mentally ill, transgender woman. She was a drag queen and a sex worker, and she was also one of the heroes of the gay liberation movement and the fight for LGBTQ+ rights as early as the formative Stonewall Uprising of 1969. A well-known face in the New York City gay scene, Johnson was a voice for transgender women, who often found themselves ostracized by other parts of the gay community and victimized by police. Johnson made a difference despite her many marginalized identities. After Stonewall, she and fellow activist Sylvia Rivera founded STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, today called the Street Transgender Action Revolutionaries. This organization helped to protect trans women, especially those in sex work. It also gave a voice to trans women in the greater gay community, where they faced a lot of discrimination from groups such as the Radical Lesbians. She was also part of the Gay Liberation Front, or GLF, the most prominent organization of the American gay rights movement. In the final years of her life, she became an HIV/AIDS activist and spoke out against the disease's decimation of the gay community in the face of an indifferent and inactive administration with the direct action group ACT UP.
This is the memorial that the street people laid down where they laid Marsha's body when they pulled Marsha out of the water. Marsha was pulled out of the water right over the edge here.
After Johnson's death under mysterious circumstances in 1992, a large demonstration by members of the gay community took place on Christopher Street to show their love for her and to call out law enforcement for writing off her death as a suicide. Johnson dedicated her life to activism and spoke out for marginalized people for over 2 decades. It is important to note her own marginalized identities. Gender and race have been described as master statuses that influence other group memberships and identities. As such, it is perhaps most important to address these identities.
Who went to the Stonewall?
Well, at first it was just a gay men's bar. And they didn't allow no women in. And then they start allowing women in, and then they let the drag queens in. I was one of the first drag queens to go to that place.
Marsha P. Johnson said her middle initial stood for Pay It No Mind, and used this as a response to questions about her gender. For Johnson, gender was complicated. A lack of proper recognition and terminology has allowed for the erasure of transgender individuals from history, as if transgender people did not exist until there were clear words to describe them. The word transgender was coined in 1965 by psychologist John F. Olivan, but it wasn't commonly used outside medical and psychological fields until at least the 1980s, and it wasn't until the 1990s that the term was applied as widely and as often as it is today. The perception of trans people in Johnson's time, even among the gay community, was generally that they were whatever gender they were assigned at birth, until and unless they had genital reassignment surgery, at which point they went from transvestites to transsexuals. People who we would today call transgender women were in the mid-20th century considered gay men, regardless of sexual preference. Johnson herself identified as gay and as a transvestite, but virtually always stuck to her feminine name and pronouns. Marsha was not a drag persona, it was her identity. This gray area in terminology had a great impact on the lives of Johnson and other transgender and gender non-conforming people during the mid-late 20th century. Transgender women were often excluded from gay spaces. To the gay male community at large, transvestites were not considered men. The famous Stonewall Inn, the important New York gay bar where Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and other trans women led the 1969 uprising that is considered to have sparked the gay liberation movement, ironically didn't allow women and drag queens in at all until the late 1960s. Cisgender women in the gay community were often exclusionary of trans people as well. Groups such as the Radical Lesbians accused trans women of mocking femininity. Trans women faced marginalization even within the gay community. Outside the community, trans people were the most targeted by discrimination and violence, including by police. Sylvia Rivera, a close friend of Johnson's who then identified as a transvestite, but personally adopted the label of transgender before her death in 2002, shared her experience in an interview with transgender activist Leslie Feinberg. According to Rivera, transgender teenagers like herself in the 1960s could expect to be beaten up and raped by police officers on a fairly regular basis. They could also expect to be disproportionately targeted because of their appearance and their identity as transgender individuals. Marsha P. Johnson herself was arrested many times for minor crimes including prostitution and vagrancy. Like other transgender women in her place and time, Johnson lived with a target on her back. Her death in 1992 was met with suspicion by members of the community, who criticized the police for being too dismissive of evidence that it was a homicide and therefore enabling homophobic and transphobic hate crimes. The institutional prejudice followed Johnson her whole life and contributed to and perpetuated a culture that excuses violence against transgender women. Of course, Johnson's identity as a transgender woman is only part of the story. As an African American, she was likely to encounter state-sanctioned violence regardless of her gender. Even today, decades after the advancements made by the civil rights movement, over 40% of the United States imprisoned population is black, while African Americans only make up about 13% of the country's total population. After World War II, urban areas across the country, and especially in the North, saw a rise in anti-black violence by police, which is referred to by communist activists as lynching Northern style. During the 1950s and 60s, there was major opposition to state-sanctioned violence and institutional racism with the civil rights movement, which was most successful in the mid-1960s. However, 1968 marked the assassination of major civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights advocate Senator Robert F. Kennedy, as well as the election of Richard Nixon as president. The Nixon administration's direct targeting of African Americans starting in 1969 led to what could be considered a criminalization of the black identity. It has been said that the progress made during the civil rights movement had been mostly undone by the 1980s. African American communities faced intense police infiltration and mass incarceration into the early 1990s under the guise of Nixon's war on crime and Reagan's war on drugs. In fact, the CIA likely flooded African American communities like Harlem with drugs, heroin in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and crack cocaine in the 1980s. Being black during Martha P. Johnson's lifetime meant being a target for brutality. The intersection of her identities is important as well. Not only did her race combine with her gender and sexual identities to make her a massive target, but it was within the intersection of these identities that Johnson made her home. In the mid-late 20th century, the gay community as a subculture was largely non-white, mostly black and Latinx. Balls, drag shows, and voguing came directly from queer black and Latinx people. Both the black community and the gay community had relatively high rates of incarceration, poverty, and HIV/AIDS. Many early leaders of the gay liberation movement, such as those present at Stonewall, were people of color. A 2012 study on anti-LGBTQ and HIV-affected hate violence found that transgender people of color were 2.59 times as likely to experience police violence as white cisgender people. During her life, Johnson was never just a transgender woman, nor was she ever just an African American woman. She was always both, and that had an impact on virtually all aspects of her life. Not all of Johnson's identities were marginalized. For instance, she was able-bodied. People with physical disabilities have a very long history of oppression in the United States. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, disabled people were considered to be social deviants and faced widespread sterilization and so-called ugly laws that restricted where and when people with physical deformities could be in public, the last of which in the United States was repealed only in the 1970s. Legal protections have improved due in part to the disability rights movement since the last ugly law was repealed, but things have not improved enough. In a 2012 study on victims of hate violence, 35% of survivors and victims reported having a physical disability. Accommodations and aid given to disabled people are frequently discussed as charity, which undermines the necessity of services that disabled people require to live. Johnson's identity as an able-bodied person gave her privilege in many ways over those with disabilities, because the institutional barriers to accessibility, healthcare, and many other facets of life that so many disabled people are confronted with every day did not apply to her. I relate to Marsha P. Johnson because I'm also a transgender woman. Like Johnson, I also have mental illness. We also share a few privileged identities, such as being able-bodied, US-born native English speakers. However, unlike Johnson, I'm white and I come from a middle-class background. As a transgender person, I have faced threats of physical and sexual violence, had my identity denied to me, and otherwise faced harassment from people in my life, strangers, and institutions like my university. Being trans means feeling unsafe in a lot of places. It means talking carefully to officials and law enforcement. It means being essentially forced to use all gender bathrooms, which are few and far between on campus, for fear of being attacked physically, sexually, or legally. Like Johnson and so many others, I have a target on my back because of this part of my identity. However, as a white person, I do not know the experience of living as a racial minority. I've never been a victim of racism. I do not have the same feeling of being criminalized, disadvantaged, and targeted for my heritage like many people of color do. My social location as a white, middle-class, native English-speaking, able-bodied, bisexual, transgender woman, born in the United States, informs every aspect of my life and colors the way that I interact with every major institution. I recognize that I have more privilege than Marsha P. Johnson did, and even though some of my experiences are very much related, I understand that being a transgender woman is not as difficult as it would be if I also shared those other marginalized identities.